Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It's What's New in Service Virtualization 10.8. It will be presented by Beverly Mindle. You are all hard muted, just to let you know. You can type in your questions. After the presentation, you will be unmuted and you'll be allowed to unmute yourself and ask questions directly of Beverly. So Beverly, now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pam. Thank you, everyone that has joined. Today, we're going to talk about what's new in Service Virtualization 10.8. We have just a general disclaimer. I'm going to move on and kind of jump into the agenda. First, we're going to kind of get an overview so we can see what are the features we'll talk about. We'll dig into some additional details around the features, and then we'll get to see what do these features actually look like in use. Then we'll talk about, well, now that we know these features are available, how do I actually upgrade to 10.8? What does that flow look like? And we'll end with closing thoughts. That said, if you have questions throughout, feel free to type them in the chat so you don't forget. I will do my best if there's some points to take a look and see from a timing perspective. However, it may be there's a lot to cover and we may cover those at the end, but I don't want you to forget them. Jump in, add your questions as you have them. So without further ado, let's talk about what's in 10.8. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice is there's actually a lot in Service Virtualization 10.8. And we're going to deep dive into most of these, but you'll see that we have sort of kind of themes. We have certain kinds of changes, such as new protocols like gRPC and our header match. We have a lot of automation improvements, things like the API capabilities to make it simpler to create and update virtual services. We have ease of use types of features, like improving the match log for debugging, things like learn success only mode, so it's easier to maintain your virtual services, and improvements to the virtual service catalog, making it easier to find and share and reuse virtual services. But I'd like to take a minute to highlight our container support. And 10.8 has simplified the setup required to deploy on their containers. It's the advantage, obviously, of using cloud native, is it makes it easier to bring up and down environments on demand so you can manage your resources better. But it also makes things like maintenance and upgrades easier. And in addition to certifying cloud platforms, we have also, certified things like Nginx and OpenShift if you're looking at how you would like to deploy. We've added support for Helm 3 and have provided a single Helm to be able to manage your Kubernetes environment, whether you're using things like Nginx, OpenShift, Contour, Ingress, etc. for your Kubernetes. We've simplified the process of setting up SSL. And with 10.8, we also only expose one public address, and the workstation can connect over HTTP. Now, to do that, that does require that you also upgrade your workstation to 10.8, but you don't have to open up a TCP connection in order for the workstation to be able to connect in. So there's a lot of new capabilities in our containers to simplify the setup and make it easier to use so that you can easily deploy service virtualization using cloud native. Additionally, we have a number of other improvements, and many of these we're going to discuss further. I'd like to highlight a few. The first is with our developer plugins. We have a number of developer plugins from some generic ones that can work across IDEs like SVS Code to specific ones like our Eclipse and IntelliJ. And we continue to not only add new capabilities as we have enhanced the API in terms of what it can do, but also supporting the latest versions. With the 10.8, you'll see that there's been a refresh as well in our UI. So things like the portal, enterprise dashboard, IAM. This is just going to have a more kind of modern look and feel. It shouldn't be significantly different in terms of how you would use it. And there's also some advantages that it is obviously more accessible as well. And so you'll see some advantages when you look at using our new UIs. And then finally, from an environment management, and security improvements perspective, you'll see that we've done a number of enhancements, things like upgrading OpenJDK to OpenJDK 17, adding IPv6 support, both within the components of the server components, as well as using it for virtual services or application tests. Being able to have TLS 1.3 support and native P12 support. We're going to continue. We introduced a patch, service pack and patch process post 10.7.2. This will continue with 10.8. And you'll see in our documentation, we have additional OS and database version support. And security is paramount, and we continue to address vulnerabilities, and we will continue to do so as well as you upgrade to the latest service pack. So this will be an ongoing thing. And without further ado, we'll go into the details. So let's talk about the features. I'm going to start with the native header match. And I want to highlight, first of all, today you can do matches on headers, but what you have to do is use something like an RDM, and you have to convert it to an argument. And then you also probably are adding logic when you get the request, right? Because the application's not going to change how it passes it, so that it can convert it to an argument and you can evaluate and match upon it. With this new native header match, basically you don't have to convert it to an argument. You can identify via either the workstation or the sidecar properties of the v3 API. You can identify which are the elements in the header that you want to match on, and those will be considered along with the arguments. If I have an exact match, I have to have all the arguments, keys, and values, and any identified headers, keys, and values match. If it's a signature or a meta match, I'm not evaluating that value. I'm only evaluating that key. But now the application does not have to change how it is passing. You don't have to add any sort of additional logic. And you can do this programmatically through the APIs as well to make it simpler for automating. We've added a number of other API enhancements. We have the ability to specify multiple data protocols, including adding the SOAP header data protocol. Order matters if you are using multiple data protocols, just like the workstation does. But you have that support now if you're creating a virtual service through the APIs. Additionally, we've added the ability to build native data-driven virtual services. So previously in 10.7, we introduced the ability, if you've got a data-driven virtual service, to swap out the data so that I could have the right scenarios at the time that I need for testing. And I just have to replace, via an API call, what is the file that I'm referencing so that I have the right scenarios for my testing. But to actually create that data-driven virtual service, that had to be created first. This allows me to programmatically create a data-driven virtual service. So I could take my specification file or an example RR pair or an existing running virtual service, basically create or deploy that. I would then be able to get back, calling that service to understand what that meta transaction ID is. And next, I basically map it. So I take that information along with the data file I want to reference, and then I can decide how my response should be, whether it's a column in that data file or whether I want to actually create, the string of the response, potentially even referencing some other columns in it. But this can all be done programmatically, and of course, once created, easy to swap out that data programmatically as well. Now, we have also added a capability to be able to match on a header element as an argument, similar to that RDM I described. Now, in this example, I've showed you how you would update the sidecars. You are able to specify that headers added as arguments, and you can identify any of the headers. If there's more than one you want to match on, you can identify them with a comma in between. And this is really helpful. Both scenarios, I have something where I am passing something in the header, and based on what is passed, I want to have a different response. And this allows that flexibility. So if you're using RDM or you already have the logic in your virtual service to go and kind of convert things to arguments and you don't want to change it, you can still easily programmatically add new new transactions to your virtual service, programmatically through pipelines. If you're creating a new virtual service or you haven't designed that kind of logic, the new header match will be easier. You cannot use both together. If for some reason you have identified both when trying to create the transaction, we will default to the header, the native header match. We've also made it easier to create kind of SSL virtual services so that you only have to reference the key store file name. So oftentimes it's common to reference properties in your configuration. And so what we have done is, since you are able to pass at the time of creating your virtual service, you're able to pass the data file. We do expect you to have, if you would like to reference it, a key stores file in that zip folder, and then you have the relevant key stores. And when you do that in your object config, you can reference that. If you're looking for a virtual or a transaction to respond in a specific type of time zone, that is something you can also identify at the time of creating it in your sidecar files when you've zipped up your transactions for the virtual service. And we also make sure that you're able to clean it afterwards. Now, that's a lot of capabilities in the API. As I've highlighted, we have a lot of other capabilities as well. We've introduced gRPC support for both service virtualization as well as application test. We do support all 4 calls of gRPC. So that's unary, server streaming, client streaming, and bidirectional. And this is really helpful for both being able to not only build a virtual service using a proto file in order to kind of record that behavior, but also to test it, to validate that the virtual services or the application itself is behaving the way that I would expect. So both capabilities are available. To simplify understanding and debugging, we've made improvements to the match log. The first thing we've done, as long as you're recording onto the match log, which you would be able to see that full raw request. And this is helpful if you want to run that transaction again. Maybe you want to take that virtual service and put it in your debug environment and call that transaction again and figure out why it doesn't match. The reason I say in debug mode is in debug mode, we will provide additional information on why different transactions did not match. And in this case, this is an example of it did not match because the argument names mismatched. There could be other reasons, right? There could be issues with the values or other things. But in this case, right, the argument names did not match. But I get this information in easy to read text. I can see I'm missing password, but additional argument was password 1. Well, that tells me that maybe there was an issue either in the transaction itself for what I provided as I submitted that transaction. And while this might seem really obvious, right, if someone mistypes the password to password 1, I've seen transactions with hundreds of arguments, and sometimes this debugging is not always as obvious as it may seem. So this should simplify calling out why a given transaction may not have matched when you're in debug mode, so that you can easily understand and either fix your VSI or fix the transaction that you're using. For learn success only mode, this has been an augmentation to our learning mode. And learning mode is really helpful to learn new transactions for the virtual service. It basically holds it in memory. And those new transactions, the virtual service can easily respond to. What the learn success only mode allows you to do is it only will support learning success messages, so 200, 300 series, not your error conditions, 400, 500, etc. So what this means is that I am not overriding scenarios or new transactions with going to the live service if the live service happens to be down at the time of recording. I am only going to augment it with those success scenarios. And if for some reason the live service does go down, I can get the responses of any of the virtual services that I've recorded. With Virtual Service Catalog, it makes it easier to see what services are deployed and to be able to share. And you can look things up. I could look things up by a combination of things like operation and protocol and description, what VSE it might be running on, etc. With this new enhancement, you're able to restrict the registries that display on the Virtual Service Catalog. So I may have an environment that's purely sandbox, and I don't want to include any of the VSCs or virtual services that are there. I may have more than one virtual service catalog in order to separate by line of business in terms of what virtual services they can see. So this allows for greater flexibility in controlling and who can view and collaborate with the virtual service catalog. Additionally, I may want to do some additional review of the virtual services. We have added the ability to export the virtual service catalog results on this kind of grid. If I have any sort of filters or searches, it's going to export with those filters and searches in mind, but it will export across all of the pages. So if you've got a lot of results you may have across your environment, thousands of results, you can do additional analysis and things like that based off the export. And speaking of the performance, right? You may want to, if you've got, huge number of environments, maybe there are parts of your environment that have moved or migrated, and you only want to show active registries. This could be something that you can use. And basically you would define the parameter in that application.yaml so that you only show the active registries, and it will improve the performance of the virtual service catalog. We've also introduced with the IAM component a number of capabilities to simplify both setup as well as upgrade. So the first one is you have the ability to export and import LDAP settings. And so this would allow you to be able to, if you're migrating environments from one environment to another, not have to reset up and reconfigure those settings. We've also introduced a ._IAM property file, and that should sound familiar because all of our other property files besides the Lisa.property have the ._. And that's so that if you are doing something like an in-place upgrade, we don't override what you already have. So this should simplify as you're upgrading to make sure that we aren't overriding the settings that you have in your .IAM property file. And we've also made improvements if you've got, a large number of LDAP users and groups and things to the overall performance so that it does not take as long to set up and configure during the upgrade of the IAM component. For Kafka, we've had Kafka support for a while. We do have GSS API authentication support. So if you're using Kerberos and you need that for either virtual services or application tasks, we have added that authentication method. We have a number of improvements in the workstation as well. Improvements related to browsing files, making sure that, if you're going to a new project, to browse for a file the next time you browse, and if you get a VSI, you're probably going to browse a similar place for your VSM, right? Having some consistency in terms of the browsing across the different assets as you're choosing new locations. We've also made the browsing a detailed view, so you can see information, right? When was the last time it was created or updated, or the size of the file, to make it easier to make sure you're identifying or adding the right one. When recording from the workstation, we have an option to use SSL to server. And this is so that you don't have to choose a client key store, at which, previously that was mandatory. And so this really simplifies, the recording from the workstation. We've also Also updated, our scripting support. And so you'll see that we've added, kind of enhance the versions and what's available for scripting. If you are doing any sort of customization, in terms of how you are defining or creating your responses or using any sort of scripting for the virtual services or testing. We also introduced within the config file an option to encrypt forever. What this means is someone else, if they had access to the workstation and had access, they couldn't open it and decrypt it. Now, the password itself is something you could change. We can still allow for editing that password, but it would not be able to be decrypted once it is encrypted forever. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight that from the workstation, you no longer are required to connect to the registry database. There's a property in your site.properties that you would have to enable in order to not connect. And if you've done this, we will not have a warning, right, that you are not connected from the workstation to the registry database. Now, the only thing to keep in mind that is any tests or test suites that you run locally, so on the workstation itself, like a quick stage or a test, or that won't be sent to the registry database, and that won't be displayed then on the monitor. But if you're deploying and your tests in other ways, it's not a problem, and you don't need to have it connect to the registry database. And none of the virtual service capabilities would be impacted as well. And so this is an option based on how you have things deployed and how your users are using the solution, if you no longer wish for the workstation to need to connect or to show the user an error message. Now for today, we're going to go over a few different features to see how they look. We're going to show you the new header match, followed by the new protocol of gRPC, and then also how would I set up and configure an environment with my containers. Now before we get into the demo, I want to take a minute and highlight what we're going to cover. So for the header match, I'm basically going to have 3 request response pairs and some property files. For the first request, I'm going to have, for all of the request responses, I'm going to have a global property file with a think time spec. That's maybe I could use to figure out what is the standard response time I would expect from this service. Now, I also want to use what is the tag. I have got tag 1, tag 2, tag 3, some leading zeros, but tag 1, tag 2, tag 3, that I want different responses. In fact, I have specific 1, specific 2, specific 3, just to make it easier to see. But I want specific responses based on that tag that I'm passing. So what I need to do is also have a property file. For each of the request response pairs, I've identified that I want to match on that header tag. And for the first request, I also want it to be particularly slow or delayed. And so these are the request responses that I have gone ahead and I'm going to be using. So give me 1 second and I will share my screen again. All right, so we're going to jump in. I'm going to go ahead and use the V3 API to create the virtual service. We'll start by naming the virtual service. We will deploy, and we'll go ahead and we'll get that zip file of those 3 request response pairs that I've mentioned, along with the relevant property file. So those are already zipped together. And because we also want to open this up, crack this up, and look in the workstation, we'll choose to have the application/zip, and we're deploying this. So we are downloading that MAR file so we can take a look. And we can also see that it is successfully running. So we'll go ahead, let's open up that file and take a look at what it actually looks like in the workstation now that I've identified that there's headers that I wish to match on. So you can see I do have the 3 transactions along with that meta. We'll start with that first transaction, the specific one. And we can see tag has been identified as something to match on, but the other headers, since I didn't add any others, are not identified. I have the think time for that specific because the specific takes precedence. Again, tag 2, I am going to be matching on that, but I use the global since I didn't identify a specific think time. Same for transaction 3. And again, I am matching on the header I have identified that I wish to match on. So we'll go ahead and invoke this virtual service. We'll see what it looks like in playback. There are no arguments, so we're going to go ahead and add the tag and the value. We'll start with value 1. Now, I do expect this is going to take a little bit of time, and I do get the response that I would expect. Now, as I switch to 2, I expect to also get a specific 2, but it's much quicker. And I do get the specific 2, and we'll also do the third one. And we have specific 3. Now, let's go ahead and modify this further. So maybe I've identified that I actually want to have additional tags that I want to match on. And I could have identified this with a comma, but I'm going to go ahead and change it from the workstation. I'm also going to make the meta transaction very clear that I am getting a meta response. And this will get deployed again. Now, if I were to run the same request, since transaction 3 is also expecting additional headers in order to successfully match, I didn't get the response. I got the meta response for that third transaction because it did not match. So I need to add in header 2 and header 3 along with those values. And with those in place, I'm going to be able to run that transaction and indeed get the response I would expect. So clearly, this is allowing me to get the responses I would expect from the virtual service, but using a native header match. We're going to move on, and I'm going to share with you gRPC. Give me 1 second to get that set up. All right. So with gRPC, I've got all 4 steps already configured, and I'm going to go ahead for testing, and I'm going to go ahead and create a recording. I'm going to record gRPC. I'm going to specify the image and the model, And the transport protocol obviously is going to be gRPC. From there, it's going to be important to identify the proto file, and then the parser will render all of the services that are found within the proto file. We can identify that list of ports as well as the target host and port. And in this case, if you're using SSL on the server or not, we'll go ahead and specify what we need to use. And verify that it looks okay. All right, so now that I have connection, it's time to go ahead and record. And we're going to show you all 4 of the calls that can be made for the types. So starting with you, Mary, we will name the first and last name as part of that transaction. I get the response back from the server, and I have indeed confirmed that I'm getting that response. For server streaming, we'll do the same thing. As part of the transaction, I'm going to enter the first and last name. And then I'm going to get a number of responses back from the system. We'll also do client streaming next, followed by bidirectional. Now in this case, I'm going to identify all of the names, first and last name, for the different messages that I have. Once I send to the server, I can confirm that indeed that has been recorded. And we'll do the same thing for bidirectional, where we'll identify, the names that we need for that transaction. And gRPC is a binary serialization. It's a language for high performance to allow clients to communicate with servers as if they're local method functions. You'll see, in the finance industry, this might be used, in the stock exchange. You'll see this can be used in other places as well. And so if you have this protocol in use, you now have the ability to create virtual services as well as test against them. So we'll go ahead, let's finish this recording. We'll open up the image and model. And I can see, going back to that image, that I've got all 4 available and recorded. We're going to deploy this, and then we'll use application tests to invoke. And so that is indeed deployed. And I can see that I have the ability to identify this with an application test and get the response that I expect. And in this case, it's clear that this response is coming from that virtual service. However, you could define where that endpoint is, and you could also test your live application as well. I do expect multiple responses here, so I can see for server streaming, I have indeed gotten the various responses. We'll go ahead and execute for client streaming. And I'm able to see as well that I get the expected response. Now, keep in mind which ones you'll use is going to depend on how you have your gRPC server set up. So I don't expect that you would use all of these type of streaming methods at one time. But I just wanted to show you that we have that flexibility to be able to do that. And if we go back and refresh, we can confirm that virtual service is indeed responding to all of those. Now, last, I'd like to talk about how could I configure an environment in Kubernetes. And so basically, you can have your environment, your server components installed in the cloud or on-prem, etc. But many customers have either are moving to or are, have set up Kubernetes containers. And so I want to show how this would work. Give me 1 second. And obviously, we talked about the benefits with Kubernetes being cloud native, how you can use it to help manage resources, how it can make it easier to maintain and upgrade. So we're going to start by having a service account. We're using GCP, right? But you could use other platforms as well. And then you need to have a Kubernetes cluster. And this Kubernetes cluster has 3 nodes assigned to it. We're going to come up to a few prerequisites as well. So you're going to need to install Helm and kubectl and Docker. And you'll also need to have a storage class created. And so this is going to define where your DevOps components, your log files, and other things get stored. And once you have that storage class created, you're also going to need to have a persistent volume. And you're going to bind that persistent volume to that storage class. From there, we're going to also give you a values custom YAML. And this is going to have sections to customize. You're going to define things like your load balancer. You're going to define the platform that you're using. You're going to have things to define your database for your registry. You're going to need to, we're going to need to configure your environment. So there's a lot to fill out here based on your environment itself. And this is also where we're going to have things where you've got the images and tags that you need to pull. So basically, you'll want to fill this out for your environment. And once that's completed, you can open up your environment. We'll go ahead and open up gcloud. And you'll issue the Helm command so that you can install the pods in your cluster. So now we're working on deploying those pods into our GCP cluster. And we can use kubectl next. We can get a call that, and we can see the pods that are up and running. I need that configuration server first. I can see that it is running. And then the order matters. So IAM comes next, followed by Enterprise Dashboard and Registry. And after we have those components, we can have the other server components that I would need for my environment. And from there, I'm going to call and get the IP address for where the pods are running. And from there, I can connect into things like the portal, and I can connect into my environment. I basically can log in and create and deploy virtual services, same way that I could do if they were running, on a server, or if they were running kind of in the cloud with their standard install. And that's really the setup for setting up your Kubernetes environment. The only thing to keep in mind is if you are using broker agent, right, we don't have those components available for Kubernetes. So let me go ahead and reshare. 1 second. Should be able to go back to the PowerPoint, and let's talk about, okay, so now that I understand a little bit more about what's in 10.8, I want to understand a little bit about the upgrade process and experience. So first of all, I'd strongly recommend getting on 10.8. There's a few reasons why. One, when you have questions or issues or need support, right? It's always easier when you're on the latest version. Additionally, we'll be continuing to come out with service packs. So if you need vulnerability fixes and remediation, if you need the latest capabilities and you don't want to wait till the next release, many of the features I've shared have been released in service packs as well. You can get access to that. So being on the latest version allows you to get access to those latest capabilities. I do also want to highlight that you want to consider in the next year upgrading as well, because 10.7 and 10.7.2 will be going end of support as well. So if you're thinking about how do I upgrade, I want to highlight kind of what is that process for upgrading. And the first is obviously we want you to back up your environment, not just your assets, but thinking about your authentication component, so that IAM component, all your configuration files, your databases themselves, right? All of that needs to go into the process of having a backup. You also need to prepare for database migration. As part of the upgrade, you do have to have full administrative access to the database so that we can make, schema changes. And so you'll need to make sure that you have that and you're ready to go, or that you have used like DDLs and modified the database so that you're ready to go. So that's part of that process. And it's also important to know your environment. If there's things that have changed or are going to change, if you have new certificates, etc., these are things that you need to understand and make sure you have ready to go. And we've documented this as well. So in our documentation, we've highlighted what you need to both prepare and do as part of the upgrade process. Once I'm ready to go, obviously I need to make sure I've downloaded the installers. These are available at support.broadcom. And from there, I would shut down the service and application, the virtual service application, and I'd run the installer. If there's, I would make sure that I have configured the relevant properties. In an in-place upgrade, we will not override these property files, but if it's not an in-place upgrade, I would need to, make sure that I've put the right information in there. From there, I'd clear my browser cache. I'd bring up and make sure the identity and access management has been upgraded. And if I have any remote components as well, I'll need to make sure to upgrade those as well. So once I have upgraded a registry, all of the connected components, so if you've got portal, VSC, coordinator, simulator, broker, etc., I need to make sure that those get upgraded as well. And from there, I will start the components. Once IAM is running, enterprise dashboard comes next, followed by the registry, and then the other components of the server can be run. Now, some notes about how the 10.8 upgrade is a little bit different. The first thing is the in-place upgrade for 10.8 is supported from 10.4 and higher. I also may have a large environment. And so if I have a large environment, I may have a lot of registries. So I might not be upgrading all my registries at once. And so we have some process of how you can have older registries still connect to the upgraded IAM and enterprise dashboard component. There will be some changes. Basically, you would have to identify in the site.properties of the server machine, just a remote auth entry. And so that has been documented that you have access to in the documentation. And we also have, if you want to pull this, if you want to get that link, we do have that in our handout. And just to note, in the IAM upgrade, right, from 10.8, those certificates are going to go into a trust store folder itself. So you will need to plan that as well. And we've talked about the new ._IAM property. So basically, we will place a new property file and not override your existing property file at the time of upgrade. And if you are on Service Pack 3 or higher, you are able to export your LDAP settings. So if you want to export those settings so that if you're moving or migrating to a new environment for 10.8, or just so that you have them, you could later import those so you wouldn't have to reset up or reconfigure. Customers typically do not start by upgrading their main environment first. They usually will start at a sandbox. This is because it's low risk. It allows people to try the capabilities out, ask questions, and make sure their virtual services work as expected, and make sure they understand that process to upgrade. But once you are ready, you can choose to either upgrade in place, so in the same directory, or choose a new location to upgrade. And after you've installed, basically you'll want to verify IAM is working, up and running, verify connectivity with the other components, with the enterprise dashboard and registry coming up next. You can make sure that you can deploy your services and that they're functioning the way you expect, as well as run your tests and your test cases. So I want to leave with some closing thoughts, but the first one I want to highlight is a program that we have, and this is our designated weekend upgrade program. Now, of course, customers can upgrade anytime. We already have customers that have upgraded to 10.8. So this is not a mandatory, hey, I can only upgrade on these weekends. But the nice thing about the weekend upgrade program is that the support team is going to work with you to understand your upgrade plan and ensure that you're ready for that upgrade weekend. Additionally, if there's an issue, and if there's an issue that's a severity 1, we are always here to help. You call, we're here for you, right? If your production is down, we're going to make sure that we work with you to get it back up and running so that you're able to continue on. But if you have some lower severity issues, if it's during like a weekend that's not a weekend upgrade, that would need to wait till the week. Now, what this allows is we have a fully staffed weekend. So if you're having an issue related to upgrade, even if it's not the highest of severities, you still want to solve it because you want to make sure that the upgrade is smooth and you can go ahead and use that environment. And that's the advantage of going on a weekend upgrade, is we're going to be here to help work on additional severity issues as well. And so that's just kind of a highlight of this program. We're expecting our expected dates that we're looking at are, we've got Saturday, February 8th, that weekend, and also May 17th. If you're interested, all you have to do is raise the support case. Just call it Weekend Upgrade SV, and our support team will connect with you, make sure you have what you need to understand the process to upgrade, collect your upgrade plans so they understand and ensure that you're ready, kind of review that to make sure that there isn't anything else we need to think about or consider. And once you've kind of confirmed you are ready to go, we'll be here to help you on that weekend. If you still need help, obviously support is available. You can contact them anytime. You're welcome to contact your account team, and you're welcome to contact me. I want to highlight 2 other things. We do have in our community best practices. We have practices around upgrade We also have other types of best practices, things like naming conventions, how to configure property files. We have actual videos on content. We have even assets. So you can have access to, pipelines. So many of the features that we've done can be, with the APIs are typically customers will use via their pipeline. And so we've actually provided some sample pipelines so that you can configure it for your environment. We even have virtual service assets. So we have virtual service assets that you could call a virtual service to get usage metrics. That way you can easily configure it if you're using any sort of dashboard or reporting, or just to simplify how you get that data. We have virtual service assets on being able to see log files, because we understand that you may have users that need to review something, but they don't have access to the server to get the logs. So there's all sorts of different kinds of assets you can find in our best practice. The goal being that typically you see Doc will explain like how something works or the steps. And we also have within support, we have knowledge articles for troubleshooting, but we wanted to have something that was a little bit more kind of like a services, where it's kind of prescriptive of like, what are we recommending? What are good practices to put in place? And that's what you'll find here on the community. And lastly, we also have office hours. So you're welcome to join us. We usually have a topic for the first half of the office hours, and then we open it up to questions. And those questions can be on the topic or on anything else. And with that, I will hand it over to Pam. I think we'd love to hear what sort of questions that you have. So I'll let Pam kind of explain the process to unmute, and you're also welcome to chat any of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Beverly, and thank you for that awesome presentation. First of all, we did have a couple of questions come in. They were more around the presentation and the recording. So just to let you guys know, there is a handout that you can download. It is the presentation, it's a PDF. But there's also, because you've registered for this webinar, you also have access to the recording. So you'll definitely be able to listen to the recording. And I have unmuted all of you. So you still have to unmute yourself. So there's another step, but if you want to come off mute and ask questions, or, if you feel you'd rather type them, that's fine as well. And we'll just take a few minutes and see if we get some additional questions.
And I do see a question regarding the fact that we have, a lot of capabilities that have been added. Where would I kind of get a summary? And, I guess we didn't cover that, right? But in our documentation under release notes with the new features, you'll be able to see kind of a summary for all of the capabilities. We also link in the relevant doc where it is. So for example, if it's an API capability, we'll link you to, for example, the right place in the documentation so you can understand, how would I set up or configure, or say there's a property file I need to change. Maybe it's in site, I would link you there. So you do also get a summary of the features in those release notes. And I would recommend, making sure your users get a chance to see what's been added so they can use some of these newer features.
Hey, Beverly, this is Mukesh. I have a question.
Yes, hi Mukesh.
Hey, you mentioned one of the things like while launching workstation, we don't need to connect to registry database, right? So
Correct.
yeah. So let's say we have multiple VSs running and we want to deploy a service onto a particular virtual service, right? We should have list of registries or configuration configured into site or properties, like how it will go.
Yeah, so it's done at the registry level. So it will, so for example, as long as all of those VSCs you're deploying to are connected to the same registry, you would identify it in that site.property. If you have, I know you have multiple registries, right? So if you would have to identify it at the registry level for each of the registries. Otherwise, anything connected, you know, if a workstation is connecting to registry A that has not identified it, you'll still get that warning message, right? But if it's connecting to registry B, where you have said, I don't need to connect to the registry database, if you've identified that in your site.properties, then you won't get any sort of error message at the time that you launch the workstation. And it won't impact deploying virtual services, as you're still deploying those virtual services, right, to the VSE itself. So it doesn't require a database connection for anything related to the virtual services.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yeah, I am not seeing any additional questions coming in through the chat.
All right, well, I'm going to show that if you still need help one more time. So please, if you do have questions, right, you're welcome, of course, to check out our documentation, but you're welcome to contact our support team for help. You're able to contact your account team, or you can contact myself. I'm happy to help you as well. And we hope if you're planning or thinking about an upgrade, again, you are welcome to upgrade at any time. Customers have already upgraded, but you're welcome to also, and we're here to review your plan and make sure that you're ready to go and that you have a smooth upgrade experience. But if you would also like kind of that added knowledge that we will be staffed for the upgrades, remember that we are doing that on the 8th and 17th, and just type in weekend upgrade SV.
All right.
And thank you for joining us.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, then I think we'll just go ahead and end it for today. Thank you again, Beverly, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you, Beverly.